Good afternoon, and thank you, ESG Risk AI, for inviting me to the session. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate ESG Risk AI for doing a pioneering work in India in terms of being one of the early entrants into the space of ESG risk assessments, and possibly subsequently will go up as one of the important service providers as the ESG risk assessment and ratings take a more formalized and a regulated role in India. While there are lots of service providers globally, and some of them have been active in India, ESG Risk AI has been a pioneer in this space of having rated or done a risk assessment of a large number of publicly listed companies across many, many sectors. So congratulations once again on this initiative, and I'm happy to express and talk about my views on the subject in this session. I would step back and go back to more than a decade ago when this concept of what ESG is taking shape today was about finance, was about capital moving to publicly listed companies which use public equities, public debt in terms of, and more so as a bank, more as a banker or as a lender, to become a socially responsible lender. It was called equator principles. And those equator principles were about essentially looking into environmental, social, and governance safeguards. But they were called equator principles, to which a large number of global banks had signed into. And I think it was 2007 or 8, so it's essentially about 15 years ago. The concept from equator principles, which essentially talked about what is it where capital is flowing, are those companies exercising necessary environmental, social safeguards and have better corporate governance. And this was the framework which then subsequently evolved to sustainable banking, which was also a banking network, and then it went by the name of socially responsible investing. Of late, ESG, as it stands for environmental, social, and governance aspects, has taken some sort of a center stage. And the center stage has come in maybe more aggressively, and it's sharply increasing since the Paris Agreement in terms of climate change. So hence the presentation on ESG and climate change. And since I work in climate change, I would like to talk about the relationships and how does this move forward. Before I do that and get into the presentation, I want to make a couple of points. That it is about, ESG is about safeguards of capital moving into companies, moving into businesses, which does exercise and have good practices to take care of quote unquote social aspects, but it has got a lot to do also with how the company is run, how employees are treated, how labor is treated, how to a certain extent its business operations do not impinge and create harm for society at large. Governance is about, because public capital is used, public investments are used, is about good corporate governance in terms of representation, in terms of conflict of interest, in terms of proper use of capital, in terms of good fiduciary safeguards. So that's the genesis of ESG, and it's great to see that ESG is taking a center stage, and the issues of environmental, social, and governance safeguards are becoming increasingly important. Having worked in institutions, including rating agencies, I have a view that earlier, and as far as India is concerned, I do not think capital was bothered about social safeguards or governance at the first place. Capital was concerned about returns, and capital was concerned about whether, if it is a debt, whether there will be a debt service which will be effectively repaid. The concerns on social and governance in terms of whether the corporate existence was ensuring necessary safeguards was not a parameter in the evaluation in the providers of capital, either as investment or as debt. So this is a welcome move, in terms of a shift. And I think this has got, if this can have implications of ESG ratings, can have implications subsequently on the amount of capital that flows into a particular company or an investment, if it is exercised, if this were, and I see that ESG risk AI tries to enable it in the manner as if almost this is an additional rating in addition to credit rating, which is, I think, a great approach, because that approach lends itself to a decision making on investment and decision making on debt. With this, let me open up the short presentation that I have, and why I call it an ESG and climate change is because primarily I see some overlaps and I see some confusion over here when we relate ESG and climate change, and this is what I'm taking the opportunity to explain. So if I can start here and go on to my next slide, as you can see, about 1/3 of the global institutional capital are monitored on ESG parameter. So this is a movement which you can see from this slide that it has significantly increased, and you can sharply see the movement upward from 2016 onward. And now it has almost come to a center stage in terms of all investable institutional market capital, whether it works on debt instruments or whether it works on equity. So there is a corporate evaluation of businesses in terms of how they're doing on ESG parameters. The question is, this is produced as a risk, as an uncovered risk, because a company taking care of certain aspects, certain social aspects, certain governance aspects gets a certain score, and the rest remains uncovered, and it is construed as a risk because there could either be regulation, there could either be a social, I would say, stakeholder concern on whether the corporate is taking care or not. And this brings me to my next slide, where I'm trying to link and explain the ESG factors of exposure management and controversies on environment, social, and governance. The slide is self-explanatory here. Environment is a wider term. It's not only carbon and climate, it's water, biodiversity, waste, marine sustainability. It's got to do with circular economy and so on. Social is community, employee diversity, human labor rights, employee health and safety, and possibly data security too. And there is corporate governance on board structure, executive compensation, code of conduct, conflict of interest, and so on. Corruption, proper fiduciary systems. Now, there are a whole host of parameters which comes into an ESG, and we look at them together. Now, let me turn to saying that while ESG is a great approach to direct capital towards sustainability, quote unquote, to my mind, these are necessary safeguards that needed to be exercised by capital, which was earlier not the case. And therefore, an ESG score at least provides that benchmark to do so. However, when we deep dive into E, and why am I deep diving into E? Because ESG and climate are related at some level, but more unrelated than related. And it is often construed. See, the basic point of why am I speaking over here, because I work in climate finance, is it tells you that there is probably an overlap, or probably is there a confusion. If you look at all the parameters in my earlier slide, you will find that only one of maybe 15 odd parameters is what links to climate. Climate is only concerned with emissions. So the E, which climate is concerned with, or climate change, is a factor which links climate change to ESG, is only the emissions parameter. And therefore, deep diving into E, if I deep dive further into E, you look at emissions, water, biodiversity. I've broken up emissions into carbon emissions, emissions intensity, carbon footprint, net zero target, renewable energy, energy offsets. And this is the space on the left of the screen on emissions that what we are concerned with in climate. Because ESG rating providers also are now tending to provide some sort of green or a carbon or some sort of emissions rating, which I think is again a welcome move. But where the waters get muddy is that ESG allows the world of capital to carry out, and policymakers to carry out, greenwashing, and which I think is my next slide over here is regulations in ESG are starting to emerge all around the globe. SEBI has done its job, and you can see that BRSR, which is an evolution of earlier business responsibility report, is focused on 9 parameters of, let me put it, good corporate practices, national voluntary guidelines, and each of those, there's one parameter on which talks about environment, or rather emissions. Of the 9, rest of them are about social safeguards, rest of them are about good corporate governance. Yes, good corporate governance is important. Social safeguards, as it is practiced, is also important. And so are environmental safeguards on water, on circular economy, on waste, on air pollution. All of them are important. But climate confusion with ESG needs to be changed. The confusion in the mind of providers of capital, either as debt or as any other financial instrument, of construing ESG as positive climate action, is some demystification, some explanation required. And this is, frankly speaking, this is not only India. This is and you can find a lot of discussion around ESG and greenwashing, because ESG, while for sure is a positive action forward, climate per se and emissions, just emissions needs a separate assessment, and just emissions needs a separate assessment. Now the question is whether ESG can do that within as a subset, or it needs to be a totally different approach. I currently do not know if the systems need to evolve. Now, what if SEBI has proposed to accredit ESG service providers for the purpose of assigning the type of ESG product is also been stated in terms of impact of company on the environment, or the impact of the risk that the company faces given the environment that is emerging. The ratings are supposed to be sector agnostic, but I think there's a caution statement prominently displayed on the website rating reports that ESG is not a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold, which is for sure it is. But I think a subsequent caveat is also required, that ESG, good ESG practice does not mean positive climate action.